Let's begin by discussing leadership and executive experience. As mayor of Denver, you'd be leading a city of more than 11,000 employees with a budget of discretionary spending of more than $1.5 billion. Please explain to voters what experience you've had that prepares you to lead a large and complex organizations, and please limit your answers to about 30 seconds. We will start with Debbie Ortega.
So first of all, as a council person, I have had to dive through the city budget and bring forward changes that have resulted in amendments to the budget. So understanding the city budget is very important for the mayor, who administers that alongside with their cabinet. Also, as a board chair of Del Norte, I ended up having to take control of our organization when our director was no longer there. So it was overseeing the whole administrative operations that included working with a property management company and the staff of that organization, while at the same time running my own staff within the city.
Thank you. Leslie Herod.
I'm proud to represent this district right here in Central and Northeast Denver at the state capitol. I have served as the chair of the Appropriations Committee and on the Joint Budget Committee, managing the state's $40 billion budget. This work obviously is directly related to what I will be doing as mayor in managing the city's budget. But additionally, I created the largest mental health foundation in the state of Colorado, Caring for Denver. Thanks to all the taxpayers here, we now have a foundation that supports mental health and substance misuse for those living right here in Denver. We've given out almost $200 million to over 200 grantees in the city and county of Denver. I created that from scratch, and now we're operating for the people. That's how I'll lead as mayor.
Thank you. Andy Rougeau.
So I am different from many on the stage. I'm not a politician. I am a former Army officer. I deployed to Afghanistan with the Rangers. We were protecting Kabul from large suicide bomb attacks. I know what accountability looks like. I led a business. I grew from 12 employees to over 40, offered good wages, good benefits. So I know what it's like to actually have to make payroll every 2 weeks. So unlike some of the people on the stage, when I make a promise, I will deliver on it. And I will not give you empty promises, empty words like too many of our politicians have.
Kelly Brough.
I was the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, responsible for the entire budget and the operations with 3,000 members. I was the head of HR for the city of Denver, where I negotiated some of the largest contracts, particularly around health insurance. And then, of course, I was chief of staff for John Hickenlooper. The general fund then, which is the budget you're referring to, of about $1.5 billion today, was $850 million with about 10,000 employees. And that was the largest responsibility I've held.
Al Gardner.
In my career as an executive in IT, I've managed budgets, I'm going to say let's look at two sides of this. We have the nonprofit side, which I've been an executive there, and it's quite difficult because you have to look at restricted budgets. So that means you have to be even that much more careful about where you spend money and how you spend money. On the corporate side, we have larger budgets, but there again, we're always trying to look around the corner, which makes you that much more dialed in to where you want to go. In addition to that, the most important thing about a budget, I don't care if it's $1 or $1 billion, is prioritization, and that's what I've had to do.
Mike Johnston.
Thank you. I've been the CEO in different capacities for the last 20 years, from running schools to running nonprofits to running for-profit organizations. I think probably the way people would most have seen my leadership is if during the pandemic, if you ever got a COVID test or a COVID vaccine, I built the organization called COVID Check, which provided COVID testing around the state. Grew it from one person to 1,500 employees. We did more than 15,000 tests a day, helped vaccinate and test more than 1 million Coloradans, which meant people knew they could get regular, easy access to tests and vaccines to keep them safe. I think that's the kind of high-quality public services people expect and that I would deliver as mayor.
Terrence Roberts.
Yes, I founded a nonprofit in the basement of my home that has raised over $10 million now in community development projects. And we didn't raise it just through the nonprofit. I'm talking about the Holly project when it was arsoned. That's over a $10 million community development. I've spearheaded movements where we've gotten justice for victims of police abuse. I helped draft Senate Bill 217. We've done a lot of work, not just myself, but my team that's supporting me. So,
Chris Hansen.
As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I'm the one candidate on the stage who has been responsible to shareholders and to voters. In my 10 years in the private sector, I worked for a $15 billion global company called IHS, which is headquartered here in Denver. Had an incredible experience there working on billion-dollar projects, running large teams all over the world, from Dubai to India to exotic Michigan. I covered a lot of ground in my private sector experience. And then taking on the responsibility of being on the Joint Budget Committee and helping to lead that committee over most of the last 4 years, and managing a $40 billion state budget in the midst of the trauma and the ups and downs of COVID. So I bring both public and private sector leadership.
Thomas Wolf.
So my work is in the global capital markets, where there's really large magnitude of numbers. Any typical transaction, I'm in the middle, so there's a buyer and a seller, and you have to make both sides work. The first thing you have to realize is you have to put yourself in the shoes of the fiduciary. I think the mayor is absolutely a CEO, and that's their first job, is to be a fiduciary. You need to optimize. First, you need to protect the city's assets, which is what I mentioned about where our source of funding is coming from and how that's being impaired, and then optimizing the use of that within the budget and getting it to the neediest causes. Our encampments issue is, to refer to it in economic parlance, would be a compounding liability. To the extent that that hasn't been addressed by elected officials over the last 3 years, is a huge problem that we need to confront.
Lisa Calderon.
I think it's very important that a mayor is well-rounded, and I have 4 degrees, including a master's law degree and doctorate in education. I've been a nonprofit executive, including running a legal clinic for abused women, as well as shelter programs and administrative programs, hired staff, made payroll, and co-founded with community and system stakeholders the Community Reentry Project for the city for folks coming out of incarceration. Currently, I'm the executive director of Emerge Colorado, where we train Democratic women to run for office and win.
Trinidad Rodriguez.
I want to talk about my experience in the private sector and in the public and nonprofit sector. My experience in the private sector really was being one of the first people of color and one of the very few people of color to provide investment banking services in the field that I was in, and fought for many years to build a business from the ground up, the entire profit and loss statement over 23 years. And I'm proud of our success and the incredible change that we impacted in both in Denver and Colorado and throughout the United States. Secondly, I wanted, with respect to my nonprofit and service leadership experience, I have managed and overseen CEOs and executive directors for nearly 8 organizations. And these are some of the most efficient and important civic and nonprofit organizations in our community.
Now some specific follow-up questions on the issue of experience, leadership, and judgment. As Debbie Ortega mentioned, the trailblazing former Congresswoman Pat Schroeder passed away yesterday. She represented Denver in Congress in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. She was the first woman that Colorado sent to Congress. And one of her best-known accomplishments was in 1993 when she passed FMLA, unpaid job protection leave. Kelly Brough, when Colorado Democrats attempted to create paid family leave in 2020, you opposed that as head of the business chamber. Despite your objections, Colorado voters approved it. It's now law and being implemented. As mayor, both through the power of the city of Denver and your bully pulpit, how would you support or oppose the implementation of paid family leave?
Yeah, I strongly support paid family leave. I provided it to my own employees at the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. The city actually agrees with some of the concerns around the state's paid family leave, which employees pay for as well themselves out of their paycheck, and nobody gets 100% of their pay. So the city currently implemented its own paid family leave program, so employees don't pay and they get a better benefit. I would 100% support that, like I did when I was at the chamber.
Thank you.
Lisa Calderon, you said as a nonprofit leader and committed progressive, you believe in the power of government to do good with tax dollars. How will you assure taxpayers that you will be careful with their money and spend it wisely?
Well, I would certainly support programs that support the social safety net, including paid family leave, which I think Kelly has revisionist history. She led the opposition against family leave, as she did in terms of gutting worker pay. So part of making sure that you are a good steward of taxpayer dollars is also taking care of our workers. You don't pass policies to cut their pay, make it longer for them to retire, stop automatic pay raises. We have to invest in our workers, and that's part of using taxpayer dollars well.
Thank you, Lisa Calderon. Kelly Brough, you're going to be able to respond through a related question from Marshall.
This is a challenging time to hire and retain city employees. And when you were in city leadership the first time, you advocated for doing away with automatic pay raises, and then you got a pay raise yourself. Why was that fair? And what message does that send city employees from upper management?
Yeah, city employees still were then and are now eligible for pay raises every single year. The only people for city employees who didn't get a pay raise were people who were not performing their job to satisfaction. That was consistent across the board, and I do think that's a good idea. We have to hold ourselves accountable. It is about taxpayer money and making sure we're being fair. I get a chance to respond to the extra. So a huge part of fiscal responsibility is the city has a retirement program. It's called the Denver Employees Retirement Program. It's not fully funded today. When I was there, it was not fully funded either. And part of the challenge that you have to wrestle with as a mayor is either that program isn't there for employees to retire because you spent too much money, or you have to change the program rules to try to ensure it's fully funded. The change in the rules to go from rule of 75 to 85 was a change simply to increase so that it would be financially viable and there for employees. I would argue that's exactly what a mayor should do.
Thank you. Leslie Herod, some of your former employees have come forward in recent weeks with concerns about how you treat staff. When a staffer named Kaylee Browning told Denver Right that working for you was degrading, you said you'd never heard those concerns. Then Nico Delgado, another former staffer who went on to be spokesperson for the Colorado Democratic Party, said that he did come to you with his concerns and that he felt bullied and belittled working for you. Is that how you treat staff?
Absolutely not. The interesting thing is that these things are coming up right when ballots are mailing and right during the end of the election. These staffers worked for me and worked quite well for me in 2017 when I was first elected. We have been able to accomplish a lot, including passing 150 pieces of legislation into law and stepping in the gap during the COVID pandemic, sending out daily emails to my constituents, to Denverites, to talk about how you can get services, how you can get relief. Now, do I demand a lot? Absolutely. I mean, again, I talked about my mom who was in the service. That's how I was raised, and as a black woman, I've always been told that we have to work 5 times as hard to get half as far. But honestly, a lot of people on this stage and a lot of folks running for mayor have had similar concerns brought up about them and their leadership. A lot of those people are women and people of color. What I will say is that when I am brought with challenges, I address them head on. But I know that we are able to do the work because my staff has been so phenomenal and definitely has delivered for Denver.
Thank you.
Debbie Ortega, you've said your most significant accomplishment in 28 years on city council was doubling speeding fines in school zones. And around this school, people who come and go from schools, that is vitally important. But it was also during your first stint as a councilwoman. You've been back on council since 2011. So why should voters give you a promotion when you say the most significant thing you've done was decades ago?
Good question. Thank you for that. I think it is important saving and protecting our children. That the year that we brought that forward, and it still applies today, was we had 5 children that were struck by vehicles. A couple of them died. So if you want me to talk about what I've done now, I can list off a handful of things. I've been part of bringing forward a livable wage. We have adopted legislation that addresses wage theft. I have been working on a construction careers ordinance that will be brought forward next month with Councilwoman Kinich that will have goals being set on our construction contracts that will have targeted hire as well as apprenticeship hires. So it's an opportunity to create a livable wage for individuals that live in our city that want to work in the construction field. I could go on, but those are a couple of examples of things that I've been working on with some of my colleagues.
Thank you.
Andy Rougeau, you've made a series of false claims in this race. I mean, obviously false stuff, like saying you're the only candidate with business experience, which is not true, saying you're the only candidate talking about enforcing the urban camping ban, which is not true, saying that you're the only candidate not taking fair elections fund money, which is not true, and false allegations about some of the other people sitting up here on stage tonight, like your claim that other candidates were illegally paying themselves salaries from fair elections funds, which is not true. What does your willingness to say false things tell voters about your leadership?
So I disagree with you. Those are false. For example, we have a candidate on the stage, on that end of the stage, who's double dipping. She's paying employees in her position as executive director and through fair election funds. We have candidates on the stage who may say that they are going to enforce the camping ban. They will not, because they've changed their position multiple times under pressure. Denver deserves a mayor who will actually fight for a future. Denver deserves a mayor who has experience as an Army officer, as a small business owner, as a father, and who will add 400 police officers, and who's willing to say that. Because when we were at a similar debate in front of a forum of homeless, I stood up there and said, I will enforce the camping ban to get the homeless to the mental health and drug addiction services they need. I was booed continuously. But my answer doesn't change in front of that forum versus this forum versus another forum. So I am proud that as mayor, I'll bring that experience as a father, as a veteran, as a small business owner to adding those 400 police officers, to enforcing our camping ban, and to making housing more affordable in our city.
So taking issue with how another candidate is legally spending funds is very different than accusing someone of illegally violating campaign finance law. I want to make sure that we're really clear on this. You said that other folks on this stage were illegally paying themselves salaries. Is anyone here doing that?
No, to be clear, people are not paying them salaries. They are acting corruptly, because we have people not on the stage who are using fair election funds to pay at liquor stores.
I want to find out if
are using that money to pay at cannabis
We're going to move
marketing
on.
events.
I appreciate that.
I don't think anybody in the stage would be happy with politicians up here on the stage spending dollars at liquor stores.
Okay, it's time for someone else to speak.
Chris Hansen, you faced a very public test of leadership earlier in this campaign when Black and Latino candidates asked you to reconsider your campaign ad showing 7 people of color committing crimes or living on the streets. You described their reactions as, quote, overwrought, and you invoked your multiracial children. The next day, your campaign said their requests were, quote, just politics. What should Denver voters take away from your leadership decisions on that issue?
Yeah, very fair question. I mean, first, the premise of the question asked at the last debate was incorrect, because we had several different races represented in our commercial that was focused on highlighting the most important issues in this entire campaign, which is the focus on public safety and addressing the homelessness crisis. And so the premise of the question was incorrect, and I felt like I needed to make sure that folks were clear about that. That ad, I think, is really clear about how I want to proceed as mayor, the things I want to focus on, and the priorities that I'm sharing with voters. And so it was a directed political attack. I think that was clear. I think the voters in Denver know that. And the premise of the question, I believe, was incorrect, and corrected that with Kyle Clark on his show several weeks later. So I stand by the approach that we're taking, because we know we have to address public safety. The number one issue for me as the next mayor is to rebuild our public safety department. All of our grand plans in every other department are not going to work if we don't rebuild public safety. That's exactly what I think we want to focus on.
So just real quickly then, for the folks who are saying the representation in that ad did harm, what do you say in response to that?
Well, I would say that the representation at the start of that ad, of using some news footage from Channel 9, was meant to highlight the 2 biggest problems in our city right now. And there were multiple races that were represented in those first 3 seconds of the ad. So that's really what I wanted to make sure people know, and then to make sure that the voters know my plans on how to address public safety and how I plan to address the homelessness crisis.
Thomas Wolf, I like relatable comparisons, and I've heard you compare the number of city departments.
Excuse me, can you repeat that?
I've heard you compare the number of city departments
to
remote control. I like relatable comparisons. But you said there's 3 buttons that you really use on a 50-button remote control, suggesting there are too many city departments. The city employs more than 11,000 people. So how many people are you firing, and why?
Thanks for liking the mission creep. That would be the engineering view of the situation. If you've been on Denver Gov, there's 59 some different departments. A business would not have 59 different direct reports. You can easily get there's plenty of management consultants that could tidy that up quickly. I think the number is more like 12 to 15 in any business in America. That doesn't mean that anybody loses their job. It just means that you govern more effectively as an executive. You have direct reports. You give them outcomes that they need to deliver to, and you can manage them that way.
So you reduce the number of departments, keep the same number of employees.
If they're delivering to the outcomes we need, yes.
Thank you.
One final specific question about leadership and perhaps judgment. It's about the Denver Broncos. The Broncos will not be your responsibility, thankfully, if you are mayor. But Mike Johnson, I did know that you were the only mayoral candidate to tell 9 News on our candidate questionnaire that you support spending taxpayer money for a new Broncos stadium. You want to explain why that's a good idea?
Yeah, I said that it would have to be voter approved, like the last measures. I think the voters ought to have a chance to approve it if there is any financial contributions. That doesn't mean it needs to, but I said if there ever was going to be an investment, voters should have to approve it. That's not a decision the mayor should make or the city council should make. If voters want to invest in a new stadium, they should have the chance to make that decision.
Would you, as mayor, weigh in and encourage them to vote for it?
No, I would weigh in to get the best possible deal we can to not have taxpayers to be on the hook to do it. But I think in the past we've done a mixture of both private and public financing. I wouldn't tip my hand going into negotiations on what we would or wouldn't do. I'd want to fight to make sure we keep the Broncos in Denver. We hopefully get back to the Super Bowl, and we have as little taxpayer obligation as possible.